Hello, friends. I want to talk to you today about uh, hard work and financial concern. I want to talk to you about those things that you've probably maybe had experience with recently. Just even as we've gone through these last several months, one of the things that I've seen is a number of people who are pressed into more difficult work than they're used to, or very different work than you're used to. Some of you I've talked to, you have worked harder in these last 6 months than ever before. Others of you, actually sometimes even the same people, but there's certainly another group of people who have probably worried more about the future and about how it will work, especially financially, how you will sustain over the last 6 months than ever before, and that for good reason, as we've had so many questions and unknowns. Um, what we find in this text today is a few different groups of people who really all end up making up one big group, and that is their day laborers. Here's a group of people who get up every day and they work and they earn just enough to make do for that day. They earn one denarius, one day's worth of work, just to put another day's worth of food on the table. And so I want to just think about the work that we do, and also that need for constant provision. Actually, so these people here, they're working in a vineyard. Vineyard work is actually one of these things that has not changed all that much over the years. It still involves a lot of the same process. And so I went and I started looking for anyone who could help me understand vineyard work a bit more. And I found a brilliant blog. It's called vindulge.com. And the woman who writes on this blog was talking about the great romantic notions she had about what it's like to work in a vineyard. You know, this idea, if you think about Napa and Sonoma and being a part of this wonderful wine industry, then you might see all of this as something that would just be a lot of fun. And she went out and she did it. And she said, it broke me of a lot of my romantic notions, because here's the truth. You get dirty. You get sticky, you get sore, you get tired, the sun beats down on you. It is truly hard work. I wonder what some of the hardest work is that you may have done. And I'll give you a chance to ask about that in a minute. Then there's another piece to this. And there's what happens when you don't get any work. Has there been a time, have you ever had someone who was supporting your household get laid off or fired, lose a job, not be able to find a job? Have you had moments where you were worried about it? I remember when we bought our first house, driving away from signing those contracts and thinking, I can't lose my job now. What would happen if I lost my job? There's no way we could afford this. What have we just done? We see here a group of day laborers who are dependent on their day's wages. And what we see is that there are people who sit and they wait all day long for an opportunity to make enough to eat for another day. And it's in doubt whether they're going to be able to do it. Maybe you've had a situation like that. If you've ever served in our church's Room in the Inn ministry, it's a ministry that works with several men who are homeless in Lexington. They come, they eat with us, they spend the night, get a breakfast, and get out in the morning. We have them, they get up and have breakfast, and everyone leaves by 7 a.m. But a lot of them, they're up and they're gone long before that. Some of these men, they are working really hard to not still be a part of this program a few months or a few years later. And so they're getting up, some of them at 4:30, so that they can get down and volunteer for waste management jobs is a frequent one. And so asking them, so why do you get up at 4:30? Is that when they require you to be there? And they said, well, we get in line. If we're there earlier, we get first pick. You want to get a job on one of the trucks. Actually, what I learned, and this is really surprising to me, the last thing you want is to end up working at the recycling plant. They said that's one of the dirtiest, worst jobs there is. And so here they are getting up early in the morning, going out, trying to get work so that for this group who have nowhere else to live, they can make enough that they can eventually move on to something else. I'm going to stop here for you who are at home, and I'm going to give you a moment to talk with anyone you're with. When was, take this in either direction, when was either a time that you did some of the hardest work you've ever done, some of the most difficult work you've ever done, or when was a time that you were in a really tenuous position where you had a desperate need and you weren't sure if you were going to get work? So if you're willing to share, take this moment and share now. So here we've considered the people who are working, the people who are desperate for another day's worth of wages so that they can have another day's worth of food. But we also have someone else in this. We have the owner of the vineyard. And the owner of the vineyard, well, it sounds as if we're talking about God here. But I've seen several people recently ask some different questions about this owner of the vineyard to say, what does it mean that we would have this person who seems to have added house to house and field to field, taken on other people's fields, others' property, expanded his own? This person clearly has great wealth, enough assets that he could go out and keep bringing in worker after worker after worker. And what does he do with all of these workers? Well, even for the people who work all day in the hot sun, these people who they need one more denarius for one more day's worth of food, what does he do? He pays them one. And they said, is this really supposed to be God? Is it right that we should view this owner of the vineyard who seems to keep all of this to himself and distribute just this meager portion to each of them? Does it make any sense that this would be God? Because we view God in a different way. We view God's economy in a different way, that we would not exploit people who have no means. We wouldn't keep them desperate for another day. These people have said, these people, they could never build up the kind of assets to buy their own vineyard. They're going to live until the end of their days needing to get up and look for that next denarius. Is it possible that this should not be taken as an owner who we would celebrate? What kind of kingdom is this? And I want to just give you that to actually consider for a moment. What does it mean if God compares himself to the owner of a vineyard who has day laborers who are desperate for another day's food, and so they do another day's work, and all that he ever distributes is just one more day's worth? How can you square this image with the image of God? Have a conversation about it. I'll share with you some of my thoughts afterward, but I think it might be helpful for you to talk about it. So we'll come back to that question in just a bit. You can hold it in the back of your mind. But before we come back to it, I want us to see bigger context in this story. You see, what's happening before and after this parable, I think, has a lot to do with why Jesus tells this parable right here. Here's some of what happens before. In the chapter before, in chapter 19, there's this episode where parents are bringing their children to Jesus and they want him to lay his hands on them and bless them. And you know how the disciples would react to something like this, right? They would surely just usher everyone in and say, absolutely, come in. This is going to be on stained glass windows later. It's going to be a beautiful picture. Jesus welcomes the children. He's a good politician. He kisses them. But they don't do that. And children in this day, they're viewed a bit differently. Um, in this day, children would not just be seen as cute and to be seen up front in the crowd. Children would be seen as lower members of the society. They would be viewed as having less value, perhaps less dignity in some ways. Children, well, why are they coming to have him lay his hands on them and pray over them? It could be that they're especially asking him to pray health over them, maybe because they're not healthy, or maybe because there's such a great risk at this time that they would become sick and die. There's much less certainty about them living into adulthood at this point in time. And so children could even be seen as potential carriers of disease and sickness. And here they are coming to Jesus, and the disciples, they act like bouncers, like, hey, stay away from him. He doesn't have time, or this is not the kind of people who should be coming. And Jesus has to stop his disciples, and he says instead, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. So there's this question about who the kingdom of heaven is for, and Jesus is saying, look, whatever you think, it's for exactly ones like this. And then there's this rich ruler who comes and says, well, what about me? What do I do to get into the kingdom? And Jesus tells him that he's going to need to sell his possessions and give to the poor. And he walks away sad, and the disciples say, well, if he can't get in, then who can? And Jesus says, well, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. But then the disciples, are they concerned that they might not get in because they're wealthy? No, the disciples aren't. And so what is their interest in this? It sounds like they have a personal vested interest, and it comes from Peter here. Peter says, we have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us? And there seems to be this, Jesus, if it's true that if you give everything away, that's how you get in, well, we left everything just to follow you. So what does it mean for us? Are we going to be the greatest in this kingdom? Are we first in line? And Jesus tells him, he says, I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or fields, for my sake, will receive 100 times as much, and will inherit eternal life. So this is good news. If you've left anything, you're going to get 100 times as much. But then, he says, but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Now, if you stop there, you might think he's talking about the rich man. That rich man who is first in society right now, he's doing well. He's going to be last in God's kingdom. But then Jesus tells this other parable. And the parable he tells is with a bunch of people who are all in need. And yet there's first and there's last. After that parable, two of the disciples, James and John, their mom comes and asks Jesus if they can sit at his right and his left. And he says, look, you don't know what you're asking. Can they drink from the cup that I drink from? And they say, yeah, we can do it. And Jesus says, look, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. There seems this constant question about being first. Are we first in line? Do we get first dibs in your kingdom? And Jesus says, that's not the kingdom we're talking about here. You keep jockeying for position in this kingdom, but the people who have worked their way to the front of the line, they may end up finding themselves last. And the ones who thought they had no business being at the front of the line, they may be brought forward. Stop counting. Stop looking around and judging that you are worth more, that you have earned more, that you should have a higher place in this. Okay, so to come back to the idea of God as this owner of a vineyard who keeps the people put down, who keeps the people needing another day's worth. Look, in our economy, in the American economy, in the world economy, if people are left in this state, just barely getting enough for another day's meal, and that's all that we do, we could say that grace would be to extend something more. We could say that surely a good, well, the rich ruler would be expected to take all that he has and give it away so that others might have. You could understand that people who have worked hard would hope for more because they need more. And that they need to be able, they would like to be able to arrive at a point that they could become self-sufficient. But you see, we're talking not about a human economy, but I think when Jesus is telling this parable and he says it's a parable about the kingdom, we're talking about God's economy. And here's God's economy. In God's economy, we are constantly in need of more. That is to say, there is no such thing as us coming up with enough that we can be self-sufficient. It is to say that the owner of this vineyard, yeah, he is incredibly wealthy and he owns it all. And it's not even really certain that these people who he goes and he pulls at the last moment, that he really needs them in any significant way. But he wants to offer, he wants to extend grace to them. And what does he extend? 1 day's worth. 1 day's worth. And then they'll get up tomorrow and they'll need it again. And where in a human economy we would hope for better than that, in God's economy, I think it's just right. We pray that God would give us today our daily bread. And when we wake up tomorrow, we will be just as in need of God's grace tomorrow as we were today. And how much does he extend? Just enough. And it's okay. Because when he extends just enough for today, we can wake up tomorrow expecting that he'll extend it again. And those people who would expect or demand more, when Jesus has just said, look, whatever you've left here, you'll receive 100 times that. Is it enough? Yes, it's enough. But if we would find ourselves, instead of just reveling in God's daily grace for us, if instead of that we find ourselves looking around and counting and saying, well, what about them? How come they're receiving as much as I am? How come they're getting what I'm getting? Shouldn't I be first? If you find yourself, rather than being humbled that God has extended grace to you again, if you find yourself instead bitter and resenting other people for receiving it too, if you find yourself as the one serving almost as a bouncer, saying, you don't deserve to be in, why would you get so close? I'm first in line. And he says, well, then you're going to find yourself last. Because you've misunderstood the kingdom. The kingdom isn't about standing first in line. The kingdom is about service. And we don't place ourselves first in line by earning it, by doing enough, by being good enough. Instead, we place ourselves right with Christ in his world by taking a knee and serving. So I'll encourage you to have just some final conversation. And that conversation is this. Are there times that you have been particularly grateful for God's grace? And maybe it seems like he was just sustaining you one day at a time. Maybe you can share about that. And then I'll give you opportunity too. If there have ever been moments of resentment where you feel like God is blessing others more than he has blessed you, and you'd like to talk about it with a group, I'll invite you to do that now too. Friends, as you go this week, go with the peace of Christ, who continues to extend his love and his grace to all of us, and none of us are fully deserving of it. Amen.